research director, where she and her team work to understand the anti-choice movement's efforts to chip away at reproductive rights in America, and also to sound the alarm about their growing influence within the Trump administration. Ellie pays attention to the opposition so we can be one step ahead. We can adapt to their deceptive practices, and so we can support the vast majority of Americans who believe in reproductive freedom and abortion rights with the information they need to be informed citizens. Thank you all so much. Ellie, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much, Travis. As Travis mentioned, my name's Ellie. I'm research director at NARAL Pro-Choice America. And as Travis mentioned, that means I run our opposition research program. I contribute to our message testing and polling program as an expert on the far right, and I lead our work on disinformation, especially where it comes from the anti-choice movement. I get asked a lot about disinformation, and one of the things that's really been a core thread throughout my work is knowing that the anti-choice movement has really pioneered a lot of the disinformation tactics that have become so common across the radical right. So we've really been working on this issue for some time. I'm just going to dive right in and give you a little bit of an overview about the landscape we're looking at. But before I dig in, here's one really important thing to keep in mind. More than 7 in 10 Americans support reproductive freedom. That's true now, and it's been true for decades. Even before Roe, a majority of Americans, including a majority of Republicans at that time, supported legal access to abortion. In my work, I spend a ton of time focused on the anti-choice movement. And one thing I've really seen is that they know that they can't win this conversation on the merits. So they've been pioneers in building the disinformation landscape that we're all dealing with today. Here are a couple of things that you need to know about anti-choice activists. Again, they were historically unpopular, so they innovated really early. Their use of disinformation isn't new. They're just really good at it because they've had a lot of time to build their runway and build the anti-choice media organizations and other online echo chambers that they rely on today. Their tools are really refined, their audiences are activated, and they can quickly roll out new information. They're also a really top-down movement. Their leadership is very effective at setting an agenda and getting people to fall in line, and they speak with a consistent voice. They're intentional about finding strategic angles and elevating them in a really coordinated way, and they invest heavily in message development, which means their messages are designed with a low barrier to entry and really easy for their people to adopt. So let's start with a bit of definitions before we really start digging in to talk about disinformation. Disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation are all different terms that you might come across in the conversation. But disinformation is really where we're focused right now. Disinformation is what happens when somebody is deliberately pushing false information with the intent to mislead or manipulate. Misinformation is a little bit different, and it's something that you might see mentioned pretty frequently in the media. That happens when someone is unintentionally promoting claims that are untrue or misleading, but the bad actor isn't really part of that picture. Malinformation is a slightly different one that you might come across a little less frequently, but that's real information that's used in a damaging way. It can be things that are taken out of context, selectively edited, or even private information that's shared without consent. For example, the DNC hack in 2016 was an example of malinformation. We're really focused on disinformation right now because that's where the greatest threat is, and that's where the bad actors are really focused. Okay, so here's one more key term, health disinformation. And I know you heard Travis use this a little bit earlier. Health disinformation is deliberately false information that puts ideology over science and puts our communities at risk. We talk a lot about health disinformation because it can cause direct harm to people who are seeking care, alongside other downstream effects like distorting public policy on important issues, including reproductive freedom, where it can help the far right eventually succeed in blocking necessary abortion care. Health disinformation is a gigantic threat and something we urgently need to deal with. So I think we're going to do a slide here, and I'll have Travis a poll on this slide here, and I'll have Travis pull it up. There we go. So the poll is asking you, that's the previous one. Okay, here we go. Where are other places you have seen or heard the term health disinformation, or an alternative term, which is medical disinformation? People are starting to respond. It seems like you all are seeing it in a lot of different places. Social media, from friends and family, from media organizations. Great, I'll give folks a couple more seconds to finish the poll, and then Travis can decide when to publish it. Okay, great. I'm going to keep moving on, but Travis will let you all see the poll in just a second. Okay, so moving on from the term health disinformation specifically, I want to talk a little bit about the type of disinformation that we're seeing right now in 2020. You've probably heard that right-wing disinformation is a major topic of conversation right now. It has been since the 2016 election, and it's important for you all to know that it really is a problem that cuts across issue areas, although it's very important in this current space that we work in on reproductive freedom. Of course, disinformation about the coronavirus is a really pressing and dangerous issue right now. And for example, we've seen a ton of bad actors pop up to support fake cures or push inaccurate claims about the severity of the crisis for political reasons. You see a couple of headlines on your screen about how bad the coronavirus disinformation is right now, which is also a type of health disinformation. Before the pandemic became a focus, we were seeing a lot of conversation about disinformation on other issues, on things like vaccines, on climate change, about health issues like HIV, and also about the election and how to vote. And of course, there's always a ton of anti-choice disinformation out here. So just to give you all a little bit of a closer look at the type of disinformation that's everywhere right now, this is a screenshot of the fact check from Snopes, which is a fact-checking website, debunking claims about fake cures. In this example, they saw people talking about how lemons and hot water and things like that could cure coronavirus. I see that we just got in the results from our poll. It looks like people are seeing health disinformation pretty split on their social media and from media organizations, although friends and family are also using it as well. That's very true for me too. Okay, so this is the type of COVID-19 disinformation that we're seeing right now. But disinformation isn't just in the health space. It also affects our democracy. Here's an example of the kind of anti-democratic disinformation that we saw in 2016 and that we're likely to see again in 2020. In case you can't see the details in the screenshot, this is a photoshopped image from 2016 that encourages voters to submit their vote for president via text, which of course is not a legitimate way that you can actually vote. Twitter removed this tweet and a whole bunch of others like it, but this example has been held up as the type of threat that we're likely to see again in 2020. Disinformation is a huge deal, and it affects our lives in a ton of different ways, including our safety and our democracy. It's incredibly important that we're prepared to fight it, which of course is why you're all here today. So we're going to quickly talk a little bit about the bad actors who routinely push political and health disinformation. You've probably heard about some of the far-right groups that have been leading the way on promoting disinformation. Anti-choice activists, the so-called alt-right, white supremacists, men's rights activists who are openly misogynist online, and of course, right-wing media organizations, including Breitbart, the Anti-Choice LifeSite News, or Fox News, among many others. What's important to know about all of these different extremist groups is that they're all extreme, they often work together to push disinformation, and they use the same playbook. I've actually seen top anti-choice groups like Students for Life echo memes from neo-Nazi blog The Daily Stormer, and I've also seen white supremacist hate groups promote anti-choice arguments. It's really important to know that there's not a lot of daylight separating these groups, and their tactics are all very, very consistent. So I'm going to take a minute to run you through just a couple of the high-level tactics that I come across most frequently in my work. Really, no matter what groups we're talking about or what issue area they're going after, you see them do a lot of the same stuff. And these are a few that I come across most often. I'll go through each one by one. First of all, flooding the zone. And credit to Vox on this really, really terrifying picture here. One thing that disinformers know is that they don't always have to get you to believe their lies. often all they need to do is get you to doubt the truth. So this tactic is all about volume. If they put enough bad information out there, they can make it really difficult to know what's real, or even to find reputable information in the first place. The time it takes for most people to sort through bad information and separate facts from disinformation can be completely overwhelming. And before people know what's real, the media is on to the next thing, and the facts never get a chance to stick. In 2018, former Trump campaign chairman Steve Bannon explained how his team thought about disinformation in 2016, and he used this quote: "The Democrats don't matter, the real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone." As said, that tactic was incredibly important in the 2016 election, but of course it didn't stop there. The Washington Post has been tracking the disinformation and misinformation that Trump has personally promoted ever since. Here's what their tracker looked like as of January of this year. And of course, this is just the comments that come directly from President Trump. It doesn't count the comments coming from the broader far right or his administration. This tactic of flooding the zone is everywhere right now, and it's a real threat to our democracy. It's a really difficult one to fight as well, but we can help raise the volume of factual information, and we can do some direct intervention within our own networks. And we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of this presentation. Tactic number 2 is working the refs, and we also see this one everywhere. From Trump's attacks on the media to conservative leaders complaining every time bot networks are removed from Twitter and they suddenly lose huge numbers of supposed followers. With this tactic, disinformers are actively working to set up a double standard in how social and traditional media companies run their fact checks. When one of their people violates a tech company's community standards, and that standard is actually enforced, far-right activists will aggressively attack the rulemaker until that authority backs down. The next time it happens, they repeat the process, and eventually they succeed in setting up a double standard, where they alone don't have to play by the rules and the authority looks the other way. Trump himself is probably the best example of this. He can say abusive things on Twitter that would get anyone else blocked from the platform. The screenshots here are another really clear example from the anti-choice movement. In these screenshots, you can see anti-choice activist Lila Rose and her organization Live Action pushing the dangerous health disinformation that abortion is never medically necessary. This is a claim that has been debunked time and time again by medical authorities like ACOG. And it's incredibly irresponsible it's an incredibly irresponsible thing to promote at a time where maternal mortality and morbidity rates are already dangerously high, especially for Black women. This is the kind of health disinformation that we really need to combat. So what happened when Lila Rose's claim went through Facebook's fact-checking process? Medical authorities with an expertise on abortion care flagged it as demonstrably false. Of course, Lila Rose and her allies didn't stand for that. They began an all-out pressure campaign that claimed that they were being unfairly censored by Facebook, even though Facebook had only taken the minimal step of attaching a fact check to the original post, not even removing the disinformation. Republican senators quickly threw their weight into the fight and demanded Facebook give Lila Rose and Live Action a pass. So here's what it looked like after that. Facebook caved, they removed the fact check, but they left up the original post. And here are some headlines from that time. So that screenshot you saw earlier, that's live on Facebook today without any flag or any fact check attached. This is a really important and complicated issue for us to wrestle with. When an anti-choice or conservative activist violates one of the written rules of social media platforms, rules against lying about people's health, using artificial bot networks, using spam, or even hate speech and intimidation, if that rule is enforced normally, the right claims they're victims of supposed censorship. Of course, in a world of information overload and where bad actors are intentionally flooding the zone with disinformation, every decision that tech platforms make can amplify someone at the expense of someone else. The real issue here isn't censorship, but reach. In reality, these far-right activists are demanding a bigger megaphone than everyone else and ensuring that the rules that we all play by don't apply to them. Okay, so here's tactic number 3. Repeat, repeat, repeat. And you'll spot a lot of the same language across this pretty wide range of anti-choice tweets on the screen. The far right, from Trump to anti-choice activists on down, are really, really excellent at this tactic. They amplify each other, they work together to build narratives that benefit their goals, and they relentlessly repeat the same themes, and especially the same phrases. They know how easily things can get drowned out, so they're really strategic in making sure that that doesn't happen to them. I know this tactic sounds really simple, and I'm sure you've all seen a ton of repetition from their side in action, but it's really important to understand what's behind this. There's a ton of cognitive science research out there that shows that repetition is actually is effectively a persuasion tool on its own. Yes, the more people hear something, the more likely they are to remember it, but even more importantly, they're also more likely to believe the claim is true. People tend to like things that are familiar to them, so the more people encounter something, the more likely they are to report warm feelings towards that thing, even if they have no other reason to like it. The anti-choice movement knows that repeating their myths can make claims start to just feel right to people, even if they never take any steps at all to prove their arguments. So here are these 3 tactics again, and I think we're going to do a poll here as well. I'll give it a couple of seconds to pop up. Okay, cool. So here is the poll, and this one asks you to dig into the tactics. Which of these tactics could you most see yourself using? Oh, this is actually the next poll. But that's fine. We'll talk about these tactics in a sec. Here we go. Here's the right poll. Which of these tactics are you most worried about? Flooding the zone, working the refs, or the repetition? Awesome. People are filling it out very quickly. Lots of concern about all 3. They're kind of neck and neck. Okay, I'm going to give this a couple more seconds to stay up while people continue to vote, but I'm going to continue with the presentation, and Travis will let it pop up in just a couple of minutes. And there it is. Great. Really interesting that you all are seeing them as pretty much equally concerning. Okay, great. So now that you know the tactics, we're going to quickly touch on the gatekeepers. But I will note that we're really only going to scratch the surface in this section. This is something to come back to in future conversations. There are a few big groups that actually have the potential to make the kind of big structural changes that could affect how disinformation affects people's lives and how it impacts our democracy. On the left of the screen, we have tech. These are some of the big ones, but obviously there are other companies in that space. And some of the smaller to medium-sized companies have actually been really great about taking positive steps to fight disinformation on their own platforms. Tech companies are the ones who are currently setting the rules, and they've also been mostly left to self-regulate. They've taken some pretty minor steps to fight disinformation. For example, Facebook implemented a small-scale fact-checking program, and I mentioned a little bit about that earlier. There are a couple of issues there. And Twitter limited potential political ads during the 2020 campaign season. But as we talked about earlier, these rules are pretty inconsistently enforced, and bad actors have had success in working the refs. So for now, tech companies hold most of the power, and it's important for those companies to hear our concerns about the dangerous effects of disinformation. There are also other gatekeepers out there as well. You'll see them on the right of the screen, or at least a couple of images. The state of California and the European Union have actually been pretty proactive about taking steps to ensure that people have some control over what data is collected on them. And they've talked about other changes as well. Some of the steps they have taken have started to cause policy changes in how the companies handle people's information. But the US government has been pretty reluctant to take similar steps. So right now we have tech. And in the current COVID-19 crisis, they've been willing to take some steps to fight dangerous health disinformation. Preventing physical harm is really where they're focused right now, and it's important that we don't let them forget that commitment. Health disinformation on COVID-19 is incredibly dangerous. Health disinformation that impacts people's reproductive freedom is also incredibly dangerous. It's not just COVID-19 or repro. The issue of health disinformation, as I mentioned earlier, really does cut across issue areas. That's why it's so important for us to make sure that tech, as well as our political leaders, know this is an area of concern for us. And that's something we'll be reaching out to you more in the future. Okay, so last section. What can we actually do to combat these issues now and also down the road? First of all, it's really important that you just raise your voice. Right now, there's a gigantic imbalance in the conversation about reproductive freedom online. Anti-choice activists are not shy about pushing disinformation, and they just produce a higher volume of content. Check out these graphs. These are pretty old graphs, but I've seen pretty consistent findings throughout the research over the years. We know that pro-choice activists make a majority of the people who talk about reproductive freedom online. But as you see in this graph, it's a little hard to see. Their conversation about reproductive freedom in general can be sporadic and never really has these gigantic spikes or a ton of amplification. It's kind of sprinkled in with other issues, which is fine, except for the fact that anti-choice activists, which you see on the right here, are constantly focused on this issue and constantly talking about it. They might be the majority of people who talk about the minority of people who talk about these issues online, but that minority produces a majority of the content, and by pretty drastic amounts. From what I've heard, pro-choice activists say they don't feel fully confident about talking about this content online, or that they worry about backlash, which is a valid fear. When they do speak up, sometimes their side will amplify some of the problematic narratives, or they'll respond in a way that doesn't move people. So what we're going to talk about in this next section is giving you all the tools to make sure that you have that confidence and that you have the tools you need to do this and do it right. The good news is that you're really the best messenger within your network. Remember how we talked earlier about repetition and familiarity breeding trust? It's no surprise, but people are much more likely to listen to people that they know, they're familiar with, and that they have some connection with. So if you're looking for somewhere to start, engaging with your friends, family, acquaintances, or even just people who you interact with online now and then is a really great place to start and a place where you do have some clout. So next slide. Disinformation can be pretty tough to spot, and I'm just going to give you a couple of high-level tips here. Here are a couple of things to keep an eye out for. Untrustworthy sources are everywhere, so making sure that you know where information is coming from, and ideally that the information you're getting is from a reputable source that you know and know to trust, is really important. Looking out for claims that are strictly anecdotal is another important thing to keep an eye on. Often, anti-choice actors or other health disinformers will hold up one small example completely out of context and use it to try and debunk legitimate scientific studies. We also see this on climate change, which is a pretty classic example. So looking out for anecdotal information that's used to debunk science is also really important. Wildly exaggerated claims are also important. They really work to tap into people's emotions and pull on the heartstrings. So that can also be something that could maybe make you think twice or raise a flag. And then in the anti-choice conversation or anything about reproductive freedom, if pregnant people are conspicuously absent from either the images or the conversation about their own healthcare, that's often a pretty clear sign that the speaker is an anti-choice disinformer. I only give you a tiny bit of information there. That's because this is a pretty complicated issue to spot and fight, to spot the anti-choice disinformation. And we're constantly updating our information on the newest trends and the newest narratives coming out. So what we're going to do is we're going to send you this 2-pager that I have on the screen. It has a bit more detail on the hallmarks of the anti-choice disinformation, and you'll be getting this by email after this conversation, I think tomorrow. We also put out a number of Medium posts and things like that, and through our social, we'll work to kind of flag some of the new trends. So if you just make sure to keep in touch and follow NARAL, we'll make sure that you're getting flags on the newest and most critical content to be watching. Okay, so once you spot it, how do we fight disinformation? I have a few high-level tips to share to get us all started, but again, this is something that we're going to have to build over time. All right, so tip 1, inoculation. Research on how to fight disinformation suggests that inoculation is the best strategy overall. That is, we have to make sure that we don't let the disinformation stick in the first place. We've talked about how repetition of disinformation can make people trust it over time. Inoculation is the reverse of that. From a cognitive science perspective, if people know to expect disinformation, they tend to be a little bit more skeptical, they tend to ask more questions, and that disinformation is much, much less likely to stick. So this is exactly why we spent so much time talking about the landscape up front. We want to make sure you all are inoculated and know what to look for in terms of disinformation, and that's what we need you to do with your networks. It may not sound like much, but we really need progressives, including leaders and voters and people who talk about these issues every day, to know the playbook. You can take the first step of inoculating your network just by talking about health disinformation more. You can tweet about the dangers of health disinformation in this time of health crisis. You can DM your friends about the issue of disinformation, and you can have a conversation with a family member about this problem. And of course, Travis mentioned he'll have more inspiration for you later. Okay, here's another simple tactic that you can employ right away. You all know this, I'll say it again, repetition makes people more likely to remember information that you're sharing and also more likely to agree with what you're saying. Again, repetition isn't just good for getting your message out there, it can start to persuade people. To really deal with the problem of disinformation, we need to be prepared to invest the time and energy in repeating our positive messages that combat disinformation while raising the overall volume of messages about reproductive freedom and other necessary types of science and healthcare. So how do you do this? You can help amplify your friends and allies. You could be a little bit more aggressive about retweeting or repeating statements you agree with. You could find a friend who shares your values and make a pact to check each other's social media regularly and amplify each other's statements about reproductive freedom. On the topic of persuasion, one of the biggest issues in dealing with disinformation is avoiding making people defensive. And I know that this one is a really complicated one. There's been a lot of coverage lately about how people's views are very closely tied up with their identities and how they see themselves as a good or moral person. Often, people can see disinformation as a personal attack, and that can make them impossible for us to reach. This one is a lot trickier to employ, but it's important for us at least to be thinking about in the back of our heads. Identity determines people's openness to new information and can activate them in good or bad ways. If a family member or a friend is pushing disinformation, pushing back directly can make them dig in their heels and can actually solidify the disinformation in their minds as they look to justify their position and win the argument. It's really important to be strategic in finding common ground. I'll give you an example. For me, I grew up Catholic, and I have a ton of practice of confronting anti-choice arguments in my own circle and my family. But my religious background is actually what drives my activism and my values about respecting pregnant people. When I start there and connect with someone who might expect that I wouldn't agree with them on some ways, it can set a different tone for the conversation and give them a foundation to open up and see my point of view. Catholics for Choice, which you see on the screen, is an organization that does that same thing well, connecting to people on an identity level in a way that they might not expect. Of course, this isn't the only way to connect. You might find common ground as a parent who cares about the future, as an American who values freedom, including reproductive freedom. There are lots of other ways to give people the tools to rethink and deconstruct the disinformation that has already been presented to them. And again, it's really, really important to say, this doesn't mean agreeing with negative ideas that you don't actually support or supporting problematic statements. This is about showing someone a pathway to open up, never sacrificing your moral code. And this tactic doesn't always work. Sometimes you're encountering a troll or someone who is completely unreachable, and what you really need to do is focus on amplifying positive arguments. Okay. The anti-choice movement has spent a lot of time building strategic narratives and repeating their arguments. There are a couple of core things. They use the same language, and they use that language to really stick in people's minds. That's why it's so important for us to open up new space in the conversation that they haven't already tried to control. And by doing that, we can give people an entry point that hasn't been manipulated by the radical right's propagandists and disinformers. For example, when Georgia was debating banning abortion at 6 weeks, before many women even know they're pregnant, Jen Jordan reframed the conversation by questioning how the law could possibly be enforced and getting people to connect with the different ways that pregnant people could be impacted by the law or actually even criminalized. She brought in new angles that the other people in the state house were not thinking about, were not talking about. And she was able to kind of set them back on their heels, use some surprise, and shift the focus of the conversation. And of course, her statements went viral. This is another one where we're going to continue circling back. I've been working on a research project that kind of digs into this angle. So this is something we'll continue to talk about later. But I think finding a fresh angle is a really important one to keep in mind. Okay, so giving someone a pathway to walk themselves to the truth. Questions are incredibly valuable in getting people to consider new angles without feeling defensive or as if their identity is threatened. Asking someone questions doesn't mean necessarily getting in their face or provoking defensiveness, but the goal here can be to get them thinking about issues in a way that they haven't considered before, or help them empathize with other people's situations. It, again, can do exactly what Jen Jordan did and open up new pathways in the conversation. One of the things that I've been really interested in lately is some of the questions around how abortion bans would be implemented or enforced, which in my experience has helped people start to think about some of the implications of these laws that are being passed at the state level. Okay, so here are those themes again, and I think we're going to do our last poll. After this, I'm going to hand it back to Travis, and he is going to give you a couple of more detailed tools on how to employ a couple of these tactics. But again, I really appreciate your time, and we're going to continue circling back with more resources and more detailed resources to dig in on these different points and really make them concrete. So Travis, I will let you take over and stop my screen share.
Thank you so much, Ellie. Really appreciate that. Okay, so I wanted to share my screen now. First of all, it has been so fun to follow this along in the chat. Also, who knew we had so many tech support folks who are also NARAL members, really supporting one another to make sure that you all can participate as much as possible in this webinar. So hello, you all. You can't see my face again, but it's me again, Travis Bally, Deputy Organizing Director here at NARAL Pro-Choice America. Thank you again, Ellie, for that incredibly informative webinar. I learned so much, and I hope you all did too. We're not done yet. This information is not as effective if we do not know how to put it into action. So this is where your community is counting on you to prepare them for what to expect and do when they are faced with health disinformation. Look, there are 260 people at the height of this webinar who attended the webinar. If we assume that each of you have at least 50 people in your networks, gosh, I'm not good with math, but that's a lot of people that you potentially are able to inoculate against health disinformation, which is the tactic we're going to focus on right now when we drive you to action. Now look, I know all of you amazing rock star NARAL members are used to supporting reproductive freedom in so many ways, be it making calls, knocking doors, donating, voting. This is one way we are counting on you to contribute to reproductive freedom. That's a little new and different. Oh, thank you. Someone's doing math in the panels. Anyway, so look, talking with your community is another way that you can support the movement for reproductive freedom. Like Ellie said, you need to inoculate your networks against health disinformation. That is our ask of you after this webinar. Let's go over the step-by-step process you can use to do this. And someone from my team, either in the chat box now or definitely over email tomorrow, will be sharing these steps, these guidance in a Google Doc. So let me share my screen. Great. Step 1, brainstorm 3 folks with whom you can share this information. I'm going to start with my aunt, who's kind of pro-choice, but definitely someone who's vulnerable to health disinformation. Some of their friends are avid Fox News viewers, and so I know that she is hearing some things that is just plain false when it comes to reproductive freedom. Then I'm going to talk with my mom, who's a hairstylist. And my mom talks with her clients every day. I mean, when her business isn't shut down because of a pandemic. But when it's open in her hair salon, she's talking about politics with her clients every day. She can be someone, if I prepare with what to look out for, if her clients come in with health disinformation, I can do a real service to getting my mom to be a real, even bigger champion for reproductive freedom. Step 2, think about how you normally contact these friends or family. For my aunt, it's going to be a phone call. She's in Florida. I can't fly anytime soon, so it's going to be a phone call. For my hairstylist mom, I think I'm going to wait until I can finally travel back to New York City whenever we're able to again and talk to her in person over dinner. Just like slide it into our usual dinner conversations when I visit. Next, I think I'm going to go to, I have a group chat on Facebook Messenger with some of my friends. Then I have an ongoing Twitter DM group with my friends on Twitter that I direct message, and they're all my political friends in Chicago. If I can get them to know what health disinformation is, that'll be a big step. 3, reach out to 3 people you just brainstormed and practice inoculating them against health disinformation. Just do it. Remember, these conversations are critical. And remember to talk about these key points in your conversation if you want to highlight what you learned on this webinar. So you want to make sure that you let them know what health disinformation is. Remember, this is about somebody deliberately spreading false information. That false information is putting ideology over science, and it's putting communities at risk. You also need to let folks know that the anti-choice movement, they know they can't win on the facts. So this is why health disinformation is their cornerstone to really try and really spread a lot of myths about reproductive freedom. And look, if people know to expect health disinformation, it makes it less likely for it to stick, for it to have a negative impact in your community. If they know, oh, hey, this sounds like that thing that Travis told me about, I'm not going to really believe this. That's really, really critical. We'll be reaching out tomorrow to hear how we'll be reaching out tomorrow to give you these resources, and we'll continue to reach out to hear how your conversations went. We really want to hear these stories. I want to hear about that phone call you had over the weekend where you spoke with your Uncle Bob, who's been spreading disinformation on the family text chain on reproductive freedom. I want to hear about those conversations that are happening. So we're going to make a commitment to each other. Wherever we are, we've had people from Seattle, from North Carolina, from Colorado, all over. We're going to make a commitment to bind our communities together to have something in common. Because we are amazing pro-choice activists, we are going to commit to letting people in our life know what health disinformation is and inoculate them against this disinformation that could spread and is spreading in our communities. So we're going to launch a poll right now. I want to know right now, can we count on you to commit to teaching your friends and family about health disinformation? That poll is up right now. I need to know. This is so critical. Conversations. Do you know what year it is? It is 2020. This disinformation, we saw the abject terror and confusion that it caused us in 2016, whether it be elections or just plain just things we hate seeing, people believing lies that are being spread by people in powerful positions. You have a vaccine against this disinformation, this health disinformation that is inoculating your community by having these critical conversations, hopefully before it really hits your community. Great. We're going to leave this open for just a few. Great. Thank you all so much. I can let you all know that we have nearly 150 of you are committing to have these conversations in the next 2 to 3 days. This is so critical. Thank you all so much. Again, like I said, we are going to follow up with this guidance in written form, and we do want to hear your stories about how these conversations went, what additional questions came up for you as you were having these conversations. This is absolutely critical. Okay, now, many of you were asking some really important questions during this presentation, and you all are really been engaged. I'm really proud of you all. I want to welcome next to this discussion our communications director, Kristen Ford. Kristen is an absolute whiz at providing what you need to have these conversations. And Kristen's actually going to give you a summary of some of the questions that you all were asking, what came up. If you weren't following the Q&A section, Kristen's going to do that summary right now. Kristen, take it away.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks, Ellie and Travis, and for all of you being on with us tonight. I've been frantically trying to answer your questions in the Q&A and give you some helpful information as you go forward and continue to act on this knowledge you've learned tonight, and hopefully will show up in lots of useful ways in your life going forward. We had a couple themes in our questions so far in the Q&A. Some of it is around language. How do we describe what's happening? What do we mean by disinformation? Should we talk about forced pregnancy or forced birth, which is really interesting. It's something that Ellie and others in our team have been exploring, and we think there might be some real power in using some of that terminology. We had some questions about access. Right now, people, especially in Texas, are being denied access to abortion care, and we encourage you to work with abortion funds and others who are really trying to make sure people are getting access to the care they need right now. One question that we had that I wanted to tag Ellie back in for a second on is if you could just explain in a sentence or two the difference between flooding the zone and repetition. That came up in a couple of our questions in the Q&A. Oh, you've got to unmute.
Yeah, constant problem. Yeah, I think that they're very similar tactics. Flooding the zone is just about pushing as many narratives out there as possible in order to drown out the truth. And repetition really is about the specific language that they're using. They're trying to make you very familiar with a particular phrase or particular type of bill, particular turn of phrase. You see that in kind of the way they talk about these bans that they're pushing at the state level. So it really is an effort to make sure that you're getting to know the language. The flooding the zone is just about, the narrative, what they're pushing doesn't matter. It's just about drowning things out. So it can come from trolls on any issue. It can come from bad actors in the political space. It can come from bot networks. We saw a lot of that in 2016. It was just really difficult to find what was true around some things like the DNC hack, for example, which was one I used earlier. So they're, again, very similar, but I think flooding the zone is more about volume, and repetition is more about just making people feel and remember language on a really gut level. So it's just instinctive when you hear it. When you hear pro-life, for example, you know exactly what that means and exactly what they're talking about.
Helpful. Thank you, Ellie. A couple of our questions we got in the Q&A had to do with talking about women and pregnant people. We know that women are disproportionately affected by these issues, and it really is an agenda of control from the radical right to really limit women's possibilities and lock in patriarchal power. But we also know that people who don't identify as women can become pregnant and need abortion care, and that partners of women and those who support them in various ways are also affected by these issues. So that's why you'll notice we sometimes use women and sometimes use pregnant people. So there's a little bit of conversation in the Q&A about that. And a few people raised questions of how do I deal with this when I see it on my social media feed, when I see it on a company message board, when I have a loved one who's somehow gotten in their head the conception that abortion providers are somehow morally suspect, or someone is just flouting and spouting mistruths in sort of public settings or in one-on-one conversations. So Ellie talked a little bit about that in the presentation. We had some conversation in the Q&A about identity. Religion is one example of that Ellie shared. There's also many other forms of identity or connection that you could draw on to try to open the door to that conversation with someone and build some common ground to have a more productive outcome from a conversation. Some conversations are not going to be productive, and you want to try to engage judiciously and perhaps not fan the flames if you have someone who's really just unwilling to have an honest dialogue about these important issues. But just would encourage folks to really tackle things on a case-by-case basis, see if it feels like there's an opening, if there might be some area of connection or shared identity that could help to move the conversation forward, and to help people understand that, particularly in this moment when we're in a public health crisis, that doctors really have their patients' best interests at heart, and abortion providers are no different. Abortion providers are really doing everything they can to provide judgment-free care and to help women and families and people making the best decision for their own circumstances. And we really want to elevate and empower and support the medical professionals doing critical work now more than ever. So lots of really healthy conversation in the Q&A. Thank you all for being here, sharing your thoughts. We're happy to continue to be in touch with you afterwards. If you need additional materials or have additional questions, don't hesitate to stay in touch with us. I'll turn it back to you, Travis.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm going to ask folks one more time, and I'm going to ask my team at NARAL to share one more time in the chat box our virtual clipboard. I see on Twitter people love that term. Please sign into the virtual clipboard. We need to know who we're following up with, the information that you need to have these critical conversations to inoculate your communities against health disinformation. By checking in, we'll be able to make sure that we know exactly how many people. By the way, I should have mentioned this at the very beginning. We got RSVPs from every single state in this country, plus the District of Columbia. That is amazing. That is showing there's a real hunger for us to be involved and to make a difference. So we're closing right now. I want to reiterate, please sign in. The sign in form was just shared in the chat box. Just copy and paste that link to sign in. I want to remind you that we are going to be following up with everyone with written guidance, step-by-step guidance written out on how you can have these conversations. Follow us at NARAL if you're on Twitter, at NARAL. Like NARAL Pro-Choice America on Facebook. If you're on Instagram, Elise, our president, just did a Instagram live with Massachusetts Attorney General Marley. You're going to want to follow us on Instagram. If you don't have an Instagram, you're going to want to get it. Learn. It's a great way you can especially make a difference now, especially for those of us that are at home and can't leave. We're going to close now. Thank you all so much from every single part of this country, NARAL members who turned out to learn about health disinformation. This is not done. This work is not done. It begins tonight. You have the knowledge you need to make a difference. We will be following up. I can't wait to hear about these conversations. Please share in the chat box who you're reaching out to. Who are you going to reach out to first? Share a first name. How are you going to reach out to them? I want to know. I'd love to know. And this is going to be so important. Den is going to reach out to their friends. Steph is going to reach out to their mom and someone named Joe. This is really great. I think we are at an end. So I will say thank you all so much. I see Ken is going to reach out to their grandmother and their aunt. Someone's going to reach out to their friends in law school. There's a quarantine chat group someone's reaching out to. There's a video chat. So many great things. I'm going to stop reading this now because you all are definitely engaged. Have a good night. Stay involved with NARAL. Talk to you later. Bye, everyone.